Hello and welcome to the Empowered Couples Podcast. My name is Jocelyn Freeman and I'm honored to have the guest today, Rosalia Rivera. She's an expert in teaching parents how to talk to our kids about consent, body boundaries, and protecting them from both online and local predators that can exist in plain sight. You'll also hear how human trafficking, both ending it and preventing it for our community, starts at home. And it starts with that relationship and keeping communication strong between parent and child. She's going to give you some very specific tactical things to be focused on with your kids, whether they are 2 years old, 12 years old, 16 years old. You're going to learn a lot from her today, and I encourage you to go to her website, which will be linked in the show notes, so you can actually dive into her resources where she gives you actionable ways to talk about these things with your kids in an age-appropriate way. And even conversations to start with your daycare, their school, clubs that they're a part of, and your friends so that you're all aware, educated, and in action. And I know that this is not a fun topic at all. As parents, it's even horrifying to think about, but we have to. We have to become educated, and not just educated, but in action. That's how we make a difference. That is how we prevent this, not only for our children, but our community, our country, and the world. This is something I'm very passionate about, and behind the scenes have been educating myself, getting involved locally with organizations, and I encourage you to really dive in to protect your children and protect your community. So let's dive into this great interview. Well, Rosalia, thank you so much for taking the time to be here today.
I'm so happy you invited me. Thanks for having me.
Well, I know this for a lot of people is a challenging topic to think about. We want to talk about the fun stuff in parenting, and this is critical that we focus on it. But the term consent, it might conceptually make sense to people, but we might not know as parents exactly what that means. It might be a new term for them. So would you give a brief description as to what it is to think about consent as a parent and teaching our children?
Yeah, sure. And it's a great question because I think for such a long time we have connected the word to sexual consent, but it really actually has to do with body rights in general. And it's something that I think if we all grew up with, we'd have such different experiences in life. So really it's just an understanding of the idea of body autonomy. Most people have never really even been introduced to the idea. So it starts with this understanding that you have a right to your body, whether you're a child or an adult, and that you have a right to the boundaries that come with that right. And so when you have that understanding, then you can apply the idea of consent to that and say, since you have a right to your body and you have a right to your boundaries, if someone wants to do something with or to your body, then they have to ask for permission before doing that, because you have a right to say yes or no to that. And so in a simplistic way to explain it to a child, that would be essentially, start with the foundation of body autonomy, boundaries, and then this communication tool, which is asking for consent, making sure that, if someone doesn't ask for consent, that you have a right to set those boundaries. So it, intertwines in that way. I'm really just helping them understand that it's really about communication, so making sure that you're not just, hearing the words or, asking for the permission, but that you're also reading body cues and facial cues and really, getting into the nuances. And that's something that you're going to learn over time and practice over time. But if you start with those basics and that foundation, it can evolve into a really beautiful way of learning to be in right relationship with others.
Yes. And I think as parents, I know for myself, and I still have a toddler, so I've got a lot to learn in the journey, but just going through my research, learning through you, I'm finding that it's probably a fear of parents to even consider that we couldn't trust some people, or that we can't make assumptions that certain spaces are safe. For example, school. Oh, it's teachers. We don't need to teach, about consent. They're with their teachers. Or, oh, they're just at our, neighbor. They live three houses down. We don't have to worry about, teaching consent. So can you speak to even just the mindset shift for parents to realize, like, even though we think we can trust these spaces, why we still need to teach our kids consent?
Yeah, and I think that also applies even within peer-to-peer dynamics. So, if kids, playing at a neighbor's house and they're, hanging out in the bedroom and doors are closed and, there might be an age difference or a size difference, or even if they're at the same age, not all kids are being taught about this. They don't understand about boundaries, right? So there's that dynamic too. But I think it's important to understand, this sort of unfortunate truth in the world, which is that offenders will look for work. They will look to be in spaces where they have easy access to children. And we don't want to ever think that there's a possible, dangerous person within the mix of a safe space that's supposed to be a safe space. And unfortunately, because of what is called a cognitive bias, which is what you just mentioned, where people think, oh, it's a school or it's a camp, like, these are safe people, that the people who hired them, I'm sure did their due diligence, right? And so we have this cognitive bias. But unfortunately, because of that, offenders take advantage and they find ways to access jobs and positions where they can be in, access to children. So we have to be aware of that, and we have to recognize that, unfortunately, because of this cognitive bias, not everybody does their due diligence, and not everybody is doing, taking the steps to make sure that they're creating a truly safe space, whether that is a babysitter, a coach, a teacher, even other family members. So we really have to dismantle this cognitive bias and start to be educated and informed so that we can create safe spaces and allow our kids to have those, safe social experiences that we want them to grow up with. It's not about overprotecting or shutting down experiences. It's about being alert, creating protective communities and protective spaces so our kids can thrive.
Yes. And luckily your website has so many specific tools that are targeted towards, sleepover specifically, or back to school, like all of these very specific resources that I encourage everyone to go to. And I think that an underlying theme as I do more research and I'm learning about this is that it really is strengthening that relationship from parent to child. And it's, what we do is communication, especially in marriage, but also we have to communicate with our children. And so before we even get into some how-tos, some specific things that families can start to talk to their kids about in different spaces, can you speak to that a little bit more as to how to strengthen just communication and safety from parent to child, specifically talking about things like this?
Yeah, I think, when I think of what creates the safest environment for a child to be able to report if something unsafe has happened to them, or to recognize unsafe behavior, is by creating a safe environment and creating safe behavior models. And what it comes back to a lot of times is that conscious parenting model of creating trust, of being open with your communication, being as honest as you can, obviously in age appropriate ways, but really truly connecting with the child in ways that, in the past we may not have seen. So even the way that we punish, or discipline makes a big impact in the child feeling safe enough to come back to you and say, something happened, and recognizing that they're not at fault, that they're not in trouble, that you're the safe, person that they can go to, their advocate, right? So we want to help foster a really nurturing relationship that's built on trust, open communication, safety, and advocacy. And when we model that advocacy, in front of our children to others, whether that's an adult or a peer, we let the child know, my mom's got my back, my parent is there for me, no matter what happens or what I do or what mistake I make, because we have to remember kids will make many mistakes, including forgetting, a rule or breaking a rule. And if they know that they have a safe space to come back to get help, to figure out how to go forward from there, there's less risk of them, getting into a situation which will escalate or repeat. Unfortunately, this is why we see children who don't report for years when abuse is happening for years. And if we can create that kind of safe space, one, they're more open to listening to us and being receptive to the information we share because they trust it and they trust us. And two, should anything ever happen, they know they have a safe space to come back to and get help so that it doesn't escalate and that they don't get re-traumatized in the process. And that knowing that when they come back to that safe space, they're going to get support. They're not going to get criticism. They're not going to get punishment. They're not going to get reprimanded or shamed. They're not going to get less love. They know that that love is unconditional. And that creates a tremendous sense of safety that they can count on, and that they can know it actually can prevent a child from even being groomed to even get to the point of abuse, right? So there's so many ways that a really healthy parent-child relationship can reduce the risks for abuse.
Yeah, I love everything you said. And I want to come back to what you mentioned about grooming in a moment. But two questions that I think will set the stage for how people listen for the remaining of the conversation is, one is, at what age do we start talking about consent? And of course, all of your resources also break down even like age appropriate conversations, because you're not going to say everything to a 2-year-old that you would to a 16-year-old. But I'm curious what age it can start. And then also, is it important that both parents talk to the child about it in like the same conversation, or is it important that both are aware and educated about it, or does it not matter that it's both and even just one parent can take the lead on that?
Yeah, so I think, to answer your first question, you can start as early as 2 and start educating on the concept of body autonomy, right? I think it's a really empowering thing to teach to a toddler who is really trying to figure out their autonomy in the first place, right? And we tend to see these battles happen because, we hear the terrible 2s or, the troublesome 3s or whatever they're called. But, we tend to have these phrases because we think that children are trying to push back against our authority, where in fact, they're actually just trying to figure out their autonomy and place in the world. So when we start with this education really early on, we help them understand their rights and boundaries, and then, move forward from there. So you can start as early as 2. If your child's already 8 and you're like, I didn't have these conversations, it's okay. It's never too late. You can still start from that point. So, always start with that really solid foundation. And then as it relates to, how these things, I'm trying to remember the second part of your question now, because
if it should be both parents.
If it should be both parents. Yeah, thank you. So I think it is important for both parents to be on board. It's not always possible, and it doesn't mean that you're going to get it, it's not going to be as effective if it's just one parent. But in fact, it is important for there to be at least one parent, because that, we just unfortunately don't know, if there are other family members, if the other parent is even safe. Like if you're in a divorce and you feel like there's some red flags and you're not sure what's going on, you can be that safe parent for your child and educate them. But if you are able to be, together, if you're able to be on the same page in teaching this, it's that much more effective. And it's that much more important that they are getting it from, both sides, particularly because a lot of times there's grandparents involved, and having the advocates on both sides of the family for the child when we're trying to explain these things to grandparents or family members is going to be much more helpful and easier. And ultimately, it helps the child know that they have more than one person that they can go to get help. Sometimes you're in a situation where both parents who are together don't agree, and one parent is teaching it and the other one feels like, oh, this is overboard, or I don't agree with this, or I don't understand it. Nevertheless, if that one parent continues to teach it, even if the other parent challenges it, that's okay, because at least the child has that one safe person that they can go to.
Yeah.
So ultimately, as long as one of the parents is doing it, it's okay. I think we have to also be compassionate towards the other parent who's not on board, because they may have a history of a different way of being raised, of different culture background, and just being gentle with our approach of educating and informing them to bring them on board. It may happen that they never come on board, and it may be a frustration of yours, and that's understandable. But again, you just have to remember that this is really about supporting your child, not necessarily converting everyone. But just creating that awareness can go a long way, and just, talking about it. And as you're educating your child, you'll be surprised that you are actually educating the other parent in the process. So just be patient and, know that it's going to filter in some way, shape, or form. It may happen, in a slower process than you'd like, but ultimately it is going to, influence the way that they behave with the child. Hopefully it will help them convert, and they'll be, on board moving forward.
Yeah. And you mentioned a big word, grooming, which is just, I mean, more and more people are becoming aware of that term and that concept. And then also a big topic right now is human trafficking. Of course, there's been a big movie that's come out that's shed light to kind of the mainstream world, whereas maybe not as many people knew about trafficking before that. And I think there's a couple layers of questions, understanding, is there a difference between human trafficking and sexual abuse? Like, are those different things? And here's what blew my mind. So, as a parent, when you start hearing about human trafficking, at first, it's like you can't even understand. Like, your mind is so confused and heartbroken and sick. And at first I felt powerless because I said, well, what can I do? I'm not, you think of it even being across borders, right? And you're like, well, I can't go on these rescue missions and everything. And then I went to a talk, and the person speaking said, most of the trafficking is happening around you. And
Mhm.
that's what had me go, okay, that's where I need to learn more about consent and really understanding it's happening in plain sight. And so,
Yeah.
if you can even speak to if you think there's a difference or see a difference in what human trafficking means versus sexual abuse, and then regardless of what the answer is to that, how guarding our children from either local or the fear of them being taken away, how that really starts at home. So
Mhm.
I know that's kind of like a complex question there, but I'm
Yeah.
sure you've got some nuggets.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think you asked some really great questions there, and I will start with talking about grooming because it actually leads into this bigger conversation around trafficking. So, grooming is a term that I think is finally making sort of a big appearance in the cultural lexicon because most parents didn't know what this was, they don't understand it, and because of this idea in the past of stranger danger, people thought that that was what parents needed to guard against and protect their kids and teach them about. But what we do know now, and have in the last few decades, is that it's actually grooming is this method, this set of behaviors that offenders will use to gain the trust of both the parents, the family, and the child in order to abuse them.
Mm.
Um, these sets of behaviors, I'm not going to list them all, but if anybody's interested, I have resources on my website. But these lists of behaviors essentially, in order to ingratiate themselves with this family, to get easier access to the child, this is the typical pattern that most offenders use to offend a child, which is why the statistic is that 90% of abuse happens by people that a child and family knows and trusts.
Mm.
It's not stranger
Wow.
danger.
Wow.
Strangers are only 10% of it.
Mm.
So when we look at, prevention efforts, preventing abuse starts by learning about grooming, learning about what are the signs that I need to look out for. How do I spot a potential offender, right? Because we have this potential image in our mind. Again, this cognitive bias of like, oh, an offender must look like this. And if they're this person, then, they're a doctor or a lawyer or,
Mm.
a teacher, like I'm sure they're a good person. So if we look at the behavior and not the person or the profile, we can say, okay, this is something that's suspicious, or this is a red flag I need to pay attention to. Maybe I need to intervene and make sure that I don't leave my child alone with this person anymore, right? Or if my child is saying that they're uncomfortable with them, like listening because they've picked up on something. So one, it's important to be educated about what are the grooming signs to look for, what to do when you spot them, how to intervene. And then we want to teach our kids about things like tricky people and the idea of secret safety and the difference between secret, surprises, and privacy, right? So they understand how to spot a potential offender as well and be able to come and tell, right? To be able to report and disclose. So if we can establish more of that kind of education, within our homes and within our schools, we can actually reduce the risk for abuse dramatically. We can do a lot more than just, teaching our own kids about body safety, because it's not just our kids' job to prevent abuse, it's our job. And we really need to educate ourselves as adults on what grooming is so that we can, even if we see it at school and maybe the administration's not doing something about it, we can take action, right? So when we reduce risk, we're actually creating a big dent in the solution for trafficking. And so just to break down a little bit about trafficking, Human trafficking is broken down into labor trafficking and sex trafficking. And then we have specifically child sex trafficking, so any minor under 18. Labor trafficking and sex trafficking are essentially this new form of slavery, and it essentially is the same thing. It's just got a different new name that fits our current culture. Mm. When we're talking about child sex trafficking, it takes many forms. And when we can, so here's an interesting statistic I want to just put down first. 85% of child sex trafficking victims were abused as children previous to when they became trafficked. So if they were abused in non-commercial ways, 85%. That's a huge percentage, right? And the reason why, there's various reasons why, one of which is that because they had this type of abuse normalized, now that it's being done through a transactional way, the child, is still fearful of reporting if they never reported before. They may have shame around it. They may have obviously fear if they've been threatened. But it makes the child more susceptible and also less likely to spot grooming signs. Maybe they haven't been educated about what grooming is and being able to report to someone. We find that, in particular in the US, with girls, the average age of being trafficked is anywhere between 11 to 14 years old. This is an age where girls are going through puberty. They are going through a lot of changes that a lot of times, and again, this kind of comes back to the home. If they have a home where they are validated, they are supported, they are connected, like they find connection within the home, they're less likely to seek that out elsewhere. This is also a time when peer pressure, starts to come in. Kids are more vulnerable to that kind of peer pressure, especially if they're seeking that external validation. So this is where traffickers know that they can find those gaps to exploit. So really having healthy relationships, teaching kids about healthy relationships, about grooming signs and, secret safety, all these body safety rules can really help in preventing them from falling into a trap or a situation where they feel they can't get out of or they can't seek help. So if we can tackle this on the younger end of that spectrum, where we're saying from the age of 2 to 11, you've done all of this amazing work to empower your child with this education, they're less likely to be a victim of trafficking. If you can prevent that abuse from happening when they're younger, they're less likely to be a victim of trafficking. So if we can, prevent this child from going into that sort of abuse to trafficking pipeline in the first place, we can really make a huge dent in trafficking on the other end, right? So that's one thing to consider. The other thing to consider is that if we're teaching kids about red flag behavior, they can spot it and report right away instead of kind of falling in line with, there are people called Romeo pimps, which are these essential traffickers that pose as love interests or boyfriends, that will trick, and this is regardless of gender. Unfortunately, LGBTQ youth are also at high risk for trafficking because they're not finding that validation in the home or in the school. And then they come across someone who is pretending to, be a love interest and trick them into this, right? So that's one way. The other way is also through online. So online sextortion or extortion, if there is an abuser in person who is then filming or photographing this child and producing child sexual abuse material, that's also considered trafficking because that person will then exchange that in some transactional way. So as soon as there's any kind of transaction, that becomes trafficking. Yeah. And so we a lot of times don't realize that a lot of trafficking happens online. It can happen even through, I think a lot of people also tend to think of like Jeffrey Epstein, and there is some validity in terms of how frequently that kind of thing can happen, where if we looked at the Epstein case, there were, girls that were recruited to recruit other girls. And that became part of the cycle. And so similarly, we can see things like that online where someone friends someone and then they start, it could be the same gender. So a girl is contacting a girl and then she gets her to like become friends. And then, oh, why don't you come and visit me here? And then they can actually abduct the child. So this is kind of where we start to see that different kind of trafficking, which is more of what we saw in The Sound of Freedom. And then, of course, there's the other type, which is, just straight out abductions, where we see less of these, percentage wise, but they are still an issue that we do need to pay attention to. This is where, it can be a child of any age. But what we're seeing more of is this kind of online recruitment process. I worked with a mom who had a situation like that. Her daughter was, I think, 12 or 14, somewhere between there at the time, and she befriended someone on Facebook. This is a child who, had a lot of social anxiety and social issues, really wasn't going to school a lot. And the mom was really happy that she had made this friend online. She really at the time didn't know about online stranger danger, which when we think of stranger danger, that's where we would apply it.
Right.
But she didn't know about that. She was just happy this girl made a friend. And then it turned out she invited her to like meet her at the mall. They ended up recruiting her, taking her to another state. She couldn't find her for months. And then when she got her back, she was obviously traumatized and addicted to drugs and, has undergone extreme therapy. So we do see those kinds of situations happen as well. And this is why, again, just going back to that really healthy communication that we can have in our homes, that we can help foster and really focus on, how can we support our child emotionally, mentally, physically? What can we nurture within them that is not going to make them seek out this validation externally, can make a huge difference, even, when we don't realize that actually has to do with body safety. So there are different ways that it can happen. Yeah.
Yeah. So many important things that you shared there. One thing I just want to highlight, and so this is like something you can just correct me if I'm wrong, but what you said, that 85%, and you said it doesn't matter of gender. I want to check though that this can occur no matter the income status, right? Because sometimes people are like, I live in a great neighborhood. Our neighbors are lawyers and doctors. And so this is happening low income, high income, everywhere, right?
Correct. Exactly. The thing that I love that you brought that up, because the thing that frustrates me is when I hear that statement, like, oh, we live in such a great neighborhood and that doesn't happen here. It probably has, and people who it's happened to are not publicly sharing about it because they're either, afraid, ashamed, so many myriad of reasons why people don't openly talk about this. There's so much taboo and stigma around it. So you may not know that your neighbor has experienced this, that their child online, is being extorted and, this is happening, or that the neighbor across the street is abusing their child and filming it and, selling this online. So how would you know, right? So we cannot make these assumptions. Again, similar to that cognitive bias with schools and, safe spaces that we assume are safe. We have to remember that because there is no border, with the internet, this could be happening right next door.
Right.
It could be happening in your home. It could be happening with a family member. So, we see so many cases nowadays on the news where it's like so-and-so who was this, reputable doctor was just found with CSAM, and it turned out that he was actually exchanging this with others, or he was connecting with someone who was a minor and they got caught. And so we really can't make assumptions anymore. We really just have to be aware of the fact this is a growing issue, which is also important to note. It's not something that is just a sort of hit a stagnant point. This is on the rise year after year. The internet has facilitated it. And unfortunately, COVID actually made things worse. And that's why we're seeing this problem escalate. So I'm glad that, although I know there's a lot of controversy around the film, The Sound of Freedom, at least it's bringing this conversation to the forefront.
Right, exactly. And there's so much that people could take away. And I know that as parents are hearing this, especially if it's a newer topic to that you're listening to, here's a couple things to underline. One is to become educated about grooming signs. Two, to really focus on those lines of communication between you and your child and really focusing on prevention as much as what you can do. And again, her website has so many resources that give you how-tos, because I don't want you to listen to this and feel paralyzed or feel overwhelmed or now just be in fear and feel like you're going to just have to block your kid from anyone, right? That's not a way to function and to live. So I want you to know she has so many of those how-tos. And so I want to give people, before we close out, before they go to your resources online, just even a few. Maybe we do 3 for online and 3 for even like local, whether it's community events or them going to sports or sleepovers. So maybe starting with online, what are 3 things that parents can be paying attention to once their child has a device or has access to a device?
So the 3 for online that I would say is, number 1 is, first of all, learn about what it is that your child wants to use, like what is their age and stage, right? So apply your knowledge to that, and say, okay, if you want this technology, you as a parent need to learn about it. If they want, and to play Roblox, well, learn as much as you can about it first, right? So really just get educated on that. And then communicate openly with them about it. Like, hey, so what interests you about it? Let's play it together. Let's try it out together, right? So be involved. I think a lot of parents kind of see technology as a easy sort of babysitter, but we have to move away from that mentality and say, if I'm going to let my child be on this, then I need to understand it. I need to be involved with it somehow so that I understand what they're doing and how they're doing it. It doesn't have to be super in depth, but you need to know some basic understandings. The second is that I would say create a media agreement that you're both going to get on board with, right? And so this includes media agreements that you also apply. I see so many parents do this double standard of I can use my phone anytime, all day and all night, and you can't. So if you're going to apply some of those rules, be a good model of that behavior and apply some of those rules yourself. It will get a lot more buy-in from your child. And then they will also recognize that, okay, my mom is, or my dad is, doing their best to be responsible with their tech use, right? So we want to model that. And that includes even things like how much you share about them online. If you're going to later tell your child, don't post a lot of private information about yourself, but meanwhile, you're doing that on your social media of them, they're not going to listen, right? So model the behavior that you want them to apply as well. And then 3, I would say, talk about porn prevention and exit strategies, right? So unfortunately, this is a really big reason why we're seeing escalating rates of sexual violence, is because unfortunately, a lot of kids are getting their quote unquote sex education from porn. And parents are not talking about it openly. They're afraid to have this conversation because they maybe haven't even had the talk about, sex and sexuality or reproduction. So get ahead of that, make sure that you're being, age appropriate, informed, evidence informed, shame free. And then you can have this conversation about what to do if you come across adult content that's inappropriate, exit strategies around that, exit strategies around what if somebody contacts you, if you're on social media. Also, be conscious of teaching your child about social media literacy before you allow them to go on. Because just in terms of mental health issues, personally for me, I think bullying, cyberbullying, all of that, exactly. And just a lot of, even suicidal ideation type of content that, if you're on TikTok, you can go into a rabbit hole. Like, so it's really important that kids understand how to use it responsibly and also in a way that doesn't impact their mental health. I personally think that 16 and over is ideal for social media use, but I know some parents think 13 and up. If you're going to do that, make sure you're having those conversations, and definitely not younger than that. It's just a bad idea. So, yes. And the other thing, just as a bonus, takeaway too, is that please do not use the threat of taking the device away as the punishment for breaking the rules, because then your child will definitely not tell you. They are so attached to these devices. It's an outlet for them. Sometimes it's a communication tool for them. And if our threat is, if you make a mistake or you break a rule, then you're not going to get this device, guess what? They're not going to tell you what happened. So if they get into an unsafe situation, we want them to know, I don't care what you did. If you made a mistake, we'll figure it out together. And then, make that part of your media agreement, right? So figure out what is the natural consequence or the more appropriate consequence to something like that, so that they feel safe coming to you and telling you what happened. Yeah. So that's what I would say in terms of, the 3 sort of quick and dirty online safety tips that I would recommend. There's a lot more, but those are the 3 that I would say, definitely try to remember.
And it's huge what you said about not threatening to take it away, because you're right. If we use fear, if we use threats, we have to remember, what is that the seed planting in their mind? My parent is going to reprimand me. I can't tell them these things. I could get in trouble. So again, it's just that safety, that underlying that you are their safe person. And even if they quote unquote think they've messed up, that they can still come to you. And I just want to underline one thing before we come to more of like the three local tips for events, clubs, sleepovers and things like that. You mentioned porn, and I know that can be a hot topic in our work with couples. It's even come up in our sessions where they have disagreements about whether they should be watching porn as adults, like my husband wants to or my wife wants to. And we're not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but I think that's important that you two discuss that, because a common default thing is to just be like, oh, that's just what guys do. And then they pass that on to maybe their teen boys, or then they get exposed to it online. And so instead of normalizing it or just not even talking about it, we have to realize, and again, do your online research, that even participating in watching adult porn is a contribution to human trafficking occurring, and especially even linked to children. And so I think, as hard of a conversation as that is, and we've grown up in this culture of that's just what guys do. I remember my high school boyfriend even saying that to me. This is just what guys do. And I'm like, oh, okay. You just kind of take their word for it and you think, oh, I guess I'm not supposed to question this. So I just want to prompt everyone to talk about that, think about that, because there is a connection between even adult porn and what's occurring with children. Am I right in saying all of
Yeah,
that?
absolutely, absolutely. And we've seen this over and over. I mean, Pornhub is there was a huge case around this, and we know that there have been children who have been, their content has been uploaded. It wasn't consensual. Obviously, if they were children, it definitely wasn't consensual. It's actually considered child sexual abuse material, not pornography. So we do need to understand those distinctions. And there, when we're talking about it with either a partner or with children, we can also explain that there is mainstream porn, there's feminist porn, there's ethical porn, there's different types that we can look at more clinically, in a sense, to say, okay, this particular type has been known to be exploitative, to be violent, to not teach things that are actual sex ed. This is more quote unquote entertainment, much like you would see in a movie. If you're watching, I don't know, whatever is the latest Mission Impossible, that's not real life, right? So if you can kind of help them understand that, that's really important, because otherwise they're going to go into the world thinking that's what women want, or that's what guys are supposed to do. And that's, so there's a lot of toxic messaging that's happening in that. And then aside from that, a lot of that is probably even illegal. It's not even things that happened consensually between consenting adults, right? So that's really important to kind of get across when we're talking about it, particularly the older the child, if they're in their teens, these are conversations that are necessary, because it is going to come up within their peer groups, and they are going to hear those same things. Oh, everybody's doing it and everybody watches it. Like, what's wrong with you? You don't think that, there's something, like, it's okay. So these are really important conversations for all of the reasons that you stated, for sure.
Yeah, thank you for adding that. So thinking about life, your local community, clubs, sports, school, going to sleepovers, I know there's a lot there. And again, go to her website, because she has an abundance of resources that are really specific and you can focus on what's important to you. But are there 3 tips you would give for thinking about protecting our children locally?
Yeah, the 3 are essentially education is key. So educating yourself as much as possible for various reasons, not just because obviously you want to be informed and then teach your children, but also so that you can share that information with others and create awareness. The more awareness that we can create, and the more that we can normalize these conversations and move them away from being taboo, we can then be open as a community to talking about the problem, to understanding the scale of it, how prevalent it is, how it happens. Most people are really uneducated about it, right? So first of all, educating yourself can have huge ripple effects, because you're going to go out now and share that information with others and create awareness. So the more awareness we can create, the better, because when we have more safe adults who are aware of what grooming is, what are the signs to look for, how do we spot them, what do we do when we spot them, that is creating more safe people that will say, hey, I noticed this and I wanted to let you know about it just in case, you saw something too. So we can create safer communities that way in person.
Mm-hmm.
That's number one. Number two is talk about it with the people who are actually caring and engaging with your child, like who are caregivers. So whether that's a teacher or a coach or a camp counselor or a church leader, whoever it is that's engaged, even with your doctor, right? Your child's going in for a checkup, like let them know, hey, we're practicing consent. Please make sure that, when you're going to check his ear, that you let him know what you're doing and that you're asking for consent first, and like these little conversations can make a big impact. Your child sees you talking about it. It normalizes conversation. And if there were to be a potential offender in your circle, whether it's, you're the teacher or the baby, daycare team, they are going to say, okay, this is a hands-off family. I'm not going to target that child because that child's being educated. They're more likely to report that something's happened, right? So the more vocal you are, the more you're basically saying, we are a family that is vigilant, proactive, and educated. And that is exactly what an offender does not want. So it will reduce the targetability of your family. So again, have the courage to have those conversations. Talk to your teacher and say, hey, we're, teaching this at home. Here's some books that we're reading. Do you mind if I bring them in for show and tell? Or, do you have any recommendations? Are you teaching this in the class? Are you talking about it, right? Like have these conversations. So be vocal about that. Have the courage to talk. That would be number two. And then last but not least, of course, educate your children. Start early, make these ongoing conversations. It's not just one or two times, like bake this into your parenting style to uphold these values of body autonomy, boundaries, consent, secret safety, have family rules that your kids know and they can practice, talk about it regularly, have check-ins. How are you feeling about this? Does someone, so-and-so make you, are they practicing body safety? If they're not, believe your child, learn how to respond to those things in ways that support them, that support, right relationships, and ultimately that are going to be protective skills that they can develop as they grow up and become young adults. So, really stepping into this education, not just as like a side thing that you have to do, but to really enforce it in a way that changes the dynamic of how your child operates in the world. Like they're going to have better relationships. They're going to have healthier relationships. Think of what your child's going to be 10 years from now because you've been practicing this for 10 years. And what kind of, relationships are they going to have in the workplace because they've been able to learn these really important skills of, body safety, autonomy, what their rights are. Imagine a child going into the world, becoming an adult that understands their rights. Yep. And isn't just going to, take what comes and be a victim, right? Yes. They can actually be proactive in their own relationships and how they operate in the world and know that they have advocates behind them.
That's how a positive ripple effect happens. If you, as parents, even with your, friends, whether they're close friends or more distant friends in your neighborhood or at your school, your Montessori, your daycare, starting a conversation among parents, the ripple effect, and then the kids, teens, they can educate each other. Like imagine that kind of world where the parents are empowered, because we can't just say, oh, the authorities look out for things like that. Leadership, exactly. They do it. No, we're the people that hold people accountable, that speak up, that spread positive awareness and education. And so again, we can't just pass off responsibility in this, even though it's uncomfortable. And even things like, well, I don't want to seem like those weird parents. No, be the weird parent that is protecting your children and that's, educating the people around you, which I'm happy to be that person, that's like, hey, I'm the one in the community that's going to say, hey, let's talk about this. This is important. And I just want to underline a theme of this is we can't blindly trust. Just you do one Google search of just looking in your city or a nearby state and look up, there are events that happen with people you think you can trust. Just even one, just to really bring awareness to this, one I was reading was just in the last few months, a well-respected coach in, I can't remember which sport. Maybe this was from your page and then I went down the rabbit hole of researching it, or maybe I found it on my own. I can't remember, but he was loved by his community. Families, I mean, he was just so well respected, and it comes to find out he was having kids over. Hey, I'm going to just, do more practice with your kids. Like, I see so much talent in them. And he was drugging them and abusing them.
Yeah.
And the kids didn't know. And I know that's horrifying to hear as a parent. You don't want to think about those things, but we have to. We can't just trust them because your friend trusts them. So again, we have to take the power back. We have to be aware, question, not blindly trust, know the signs of grooming. So everyone, please do your homework, and your website is such a great place to start. So would you actually point people to that? Maybe tell people, where to get started, your URL, and just some pointers for really starting to learn from your resources.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that was a story that I had posted about on my Instagram. It was a coach who was there for 10 years. Everybody loved him in the community. They were stunned. He had left his phone at a diner, and the restaurant employees found it, and were looking through his phone for a phone number, and they found all this incredible content that they obviously sent over to the police, and then that's how they arrested him. But he'd been doing this for 10 years, and everybody in the, again, another example, Larry Nassar, he founded an autism foundation in his local community. He was a very well-respected doctor, had family. Like, he was not, seen as the typical offender. And obviously we know now that he was. So yeah, like, to your point, I'm glad that you pointed that out. But I also want to say, this isn't about scaring people. It's just about creating awareness. And there's so much empowering information, that you can actually take and when you take action, you take the power back. So you don't have to live in fear. You don't have to shut the world out. You just have to learn how to be safe in it. It's just like teaching your child to cross the street the right way and not just letting them run, So just want to highlight that too. So if anybody wants more information on any of these topics, you can go to consentparenting.com. I'm also on Instagram, always posting, and that's also Consent Parenting. Those are the two main places that I would send people to. And I also have a podcast, which is for survivors. I'm a survivor. So it's for survivors and those who support survivors who want to, learn a little bit more about healing and any other topic that can help them step into this information with more empowerment.
Yeah. And thank you so much for your vulnerability. And yes, go to her Instagram, follow her. But I want to just encourage everyone to go beyond just social media posts, because I feel like it's easy to see a post, become enraged or become afraid, and then not take action. And again, her website is so beautifully designed. There are different versions, like you can do PDFs, you can get something super specific. So I just encourage you to get actual steps to take instead of being afraid of, oh, my kid's going to be going to school. No, get her resource that arms you with questions to ask. And so I just want to encourage people, yes, follow her on Instagram, but use the resources that get you into action. Because that's really what it's going to take. And thank you for all of the work that you do. I truly think that you are like someone that needs to be on every podcast. I think you, really though, I think this is the most important topic right now. And
it really is. I agree. Yeah.
It's just, it really is a must.
The rates are just skyrocketing right now. And I'm part of the Brave movement, which I did also want to just point out. If anybody wants to join, on a higher level to participate in, creating a safer world globally, please go to bravemovement.org as well. I'm the chair of the organization there, and we, have been going for a year now. We're making huge changes in different parts of the world, including trying to get the EU legislation. That there's a EU legislation right now to protect kids online. So there's lots that is happening because the severity of the issue has become critical. Like, this is an epidemic levels. So we do need to all take action. And I am so grateful for people like you who are helping to create that awareness. So thank you.
Yes. Thank you for your time, and everyone really dive into her resources. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.